Is that right? Oh, there we are. Look, it's even told us this meeting is being recorded in a rather horrible voice. Um, Before I continue, Linda, any further points I've missed? No. Okay. We aim to finish by about 7:45, which is, I'm afraid to say, 6:45 in the morning in New Zealand. Let me now introduce the three speakers. We're very grateful to them for their time and trouble. And of course, there are upsides in Zoom presentations, which is that we can have international speakers. And we have one this evening who I'll introduce in a moment. But in order of speaking, we have Rebecca Gumbrell-McCormick and Richard Hyman, who will speak on Towards a European System of Industrial Relations, ? The European Trade Union Confederation in the 21st Century. Rebecca is Senior Lecturer at the University of London at Birkbeck College and also Associate Editor of European Journal of Industrial Relations and has written extensively on international labour affairs. Richard has also written extensively, to say the least, on these issues. I think the first book I ever read on industrial relations was your book on strikes, Richard, which takes you back quite a long way. And he's a fellow of the British Academy and, of course, also founding editor of the European Journal of Industrial Relations and has written a great deal on collective bargaining and every facet you can think of industrial relations and some probably you can't think of as well. And then after them, we have Yvonne Oldfield, who will speak on A Century of Standard Setting and Technical Assistance, the history and impact of transnational labour law. And here I must add a special word of thanks to Yvonne, who is speaking from Wellington in New Zealand. You're looking very bright and cheerful, Yvonne, I must say, because it's shortly after 5 o'clock in the morning, tomorrow morning in New Zealand. So we're particularly grateful to you for coming along at such an unsociable hour. And do feel free to eat your cornflakes if you need to, whilst we're thinking about our dinner towards the end of this session. Yvonne trained as a labour lawyer and previously worked in the trade union movement and as a member of the Employment Relations Authority in New Zealand, and is currently a teaching fellow and PhD candidate at the School of Law in Victoria University at Wellington, New Zealand. And her interest in her research on the ILO was sparked by her experience as a participant in the Standard Setting Convention for Convention 190 on Violence and Harassment at Work, and which she says is a bit of a career highlight. I hope this might be as well, Yvonne. Anyway, on that note, having made the presentations, without any more ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard and Rebecca. I think Richard is going to do the main part of the presentation, but Rebecca will be here for questions. So over to you, Richard. Richard, you're muted. You need to unmute. You need to unmute, Richard. No, you're still muted.
That's better, I hope.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Good, excellent. Thank you.
Right. First of all, you may have seen the message from Rebecca. She's been rather unwell and she's here, but she's going to let me get on with the speaking. I'll try to keep it fairly short so that she can actually join in after me if she wants to, but otherwise that there'll be time for more discussion before we move on to the second presentation. I'm talking about this book, which was published, I think, 2 months ago. And we'll say a little bit about the project itself, but mainly about some of the key themes. It's now working. It was an exercise involving some tensions, to put it mildly. So I'll say a little about that. Then I'll talk about the Delors years, Eastern enlargement, Barroso, which was the time when John Monks came in, and with very much a question mark whether since Juncker came in and followed by von der Leyen, whether there has been a significant shift in the nature of the European Union. And I'll try to leave a reasonable amount of time to talk about debates and dilemmas, and in particular about alternative historical interpretations of what we've written. So the project, we were invited by John Monks to write something based in particular on his experience as General Secretary. We had the official support of the ETUC, but it was not an official history. And this, it turned out, gave rise to many ambiguities. And at one stage, we despaired about whether it ever get published by the ETUI itself. This eventually was resolved, but it was a troublesome period leading up to publication. It was also a troublesome period after we started because we had an extensive program of interviews scheduled, and then COVID struck and everything had to be put on hold. And in the end, we gave much more space to archival research than we did to going out and talking to people, which was unfortunate. Mainly, we looked at the period when John Monks was General Secretary, the 8 years from 2003 to 2011, and the subsequent one term of 4 years by Bernadette Segal. But we had some discussion of what went before and of what came after. And you can read it all online without having to pay any money for it, which some of you may already have done. The period of Delors as president of the Commission, in many ways it was seen as a golden age for the ETUC, which up until then had not been a very important institution, but suddenly became much more central to developments in the European Union. The single market project in itself made the European Union a much more active institution. And Delors project partly to persuade the unions to back the Single European Act was to promise the social dimension. And this was something which contained many ambiguities, because in many ways the social dimension was always subsidiary to market integration. even though many trade unionists hoped that things were different. And I think many academic commentators also envisaged an ever increasing social role to economic integration. The Maastricht Treaty gave the EU substantial new competencies, but it also brought in monetary union, which in many ways was antipathetic to social regulation, and the constraints became increasingly obvious as time went on. As the powers of the European Union expanded, so did those of the ETUC. The Stickelen-Buch report gave the organisation more or less its modern shape. And Emilio Carvalho, as General Secretary from '91, in a sense, oversaw a significant expansion of the ETUC role. Substantial increases in social legislation, which initially had been very much peripheral to the whole work of the European Economic Community, as it was originally what became the European Union. Most notably, the Working Time Directive of '93 and the European Works Council Directive the following year, though a substantial raft of other social legislation as well. Michael might want to say more about this. The agreement between the ETUC and what was then UNISA, now Business Europe, which in many ways was a consequence of the fact that what Brian Berkerson called the shadow of the law meant that it was in the interests of employers to reach agreements where they could with the ETUC and try to shape the outcome rather than have less influence on the legislative process. This was reflected in 3 so-called framework agreements with the employers, which were then transposed into legislation. All this during the 1990s. And the ETUC could reasonably imagine that this was an upward trajectory which would continue. The tensions, the uncertainties, the contradictions, always there. And this the trade union demonstration to mark the arrival of the euro on the one hand, the euro is coming, on the other, what about jobs? And that question, how does monetary integration affect employment, was one which in many ways European trade unions fudged at the time. Eastern enlargement, it's important to say something, because this had major implications for the ETUC. The main tranche of new member states in 2004, 2 more in 2007. The ETUC opened its own membership to Eastern Europe, provided observer status to a significant number of Eastern European confederations in 1991, soon after the fall of the Berlin Wall, undertook what it called capacity building to show Eastern trade unions how Western unions behaved, which might be a slightly impolite way of putting it. And symbolically, the ETUC Congress in 2003 was held in Prague, saying, in effect, Eastern Europe is now an important part of our constituency. Tensions occurring over free movement of labour and the question of transitional measures to delay access to Western markets, labour markets, to workers from the East. This caused conflicts among Western affiliates of the ETUC, as well as between Eastern and Western unions, and indeed unions in some Western countries saying we don't want transitional measures that will only give an incentive to under the counter entry to the Western labour markets. Let's keep it above board and let's regulate it. Unions in countries like Austria in particular, Germany and a number of others, bordering on Eastern Europe, felt that they had to have extended periods of transition, and this was a cause of strain between Eastern and Western unions. Bolkestein, I'll be saying more about that in a moment. Remarkably successful efforts to achieve unity between Eastern unions and Western unions in opposing the terms of the Bolkestein Drafts Services Directive. But a feeling which intensified over time that affiliates from the East were really second-class citizens within the ETUC. And this issue still, to a certain degree, unresolved. This is one of the optimistic signs. Verdi and Solidarność demonstrating together against Bolkestein. Barroso became president of the Commission 2 years after Monks became General Secretary. And even before Barroso, the tide had been turning. And Monks often told the tale of when he arrived in Brussels, the permanent secretary to the Commission saying, "You're 8 years too late. The law years have now gone. We're in a different era." And that was very much true. EU governments in many cases had moved to the right, and in the main, the new member states in the East were headed by free market fanatics. And BUIRA was a hardline neoliberal. He resisted any new social legislation and indeed was keen on watering down the legislation which already existed. And in many respects, throughout the period of BUIRA, the ETUC was fighting a rearguard action to defend what was already there rather than to get new worker rights. Bolkestein, I've mentioned, in many ways, the key achievements of John Monks as General Secretary, organised very impressive counter-mobilisation, and at least got the initial Bolkestein proposals substantially modified with more than a little help from the European Parliament. This was seen as a major success for the ETUC and consolidated its position on the map. This was soon followed by the financial crisis. Somewhat presciently, Monks, in his Nye Bevan lecture in 2007, had talked about the dangers of casino capitalism, and he was proved right, I think, much sooner than anyone anticipated. And the failure of neoliberal models was the cause of even more intense neoliberalism with the austerity measures, the punishment-centered activities of the Troika, and then the new economic governance, so-called. And the ETUC objected time and time again, and its objections were ignored. And I think many people saw the whole experience of austerity and the Troika as a major cause of Euroscepticism in the decade of 2010 onwards. Yeah, a few other actions. Bernadette Segal took over from John Monks in 2011, only wanted a one term of office, and Visentini took over in 2015. I'll say more about him in a moment. There was an ambiguous shift in EU policy, a much more conciliatory tone, a much greater willingness to listen to the ETUC, but there are question marks about how far the main policy orientation had changed. A couple of major achievements, nevertheless: the European Pillar of Social Rights in 2017, followed by the Action Plan 4 years later, the Minimum Wage Directive in 2022. In many respects, a major success for the ETUC, but it also revealed very sharp internal divisions. The Nordic unions were always strongly opposed, and indeed wrote a letter of dissent to the Commission in 2020, disagreeing with the official stance of the ETUC, something which was completely unprecedented. And Qatargate, the exposure of the corruption scandal, primarily in the European Parliament, but also involving Visentini, which meant that having been elevated to General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, he was dismissed after a few months following an internal inquiry. And certainly Qatargate caused serious reputational damage both to the ETUC and to the ITUC. Now, I think I've left some time to say a bit about debates and dilemmas. In the book, we don't attempt to present a conclusion, and we say, on the contrary, there can't be a simple conclusion, and that the interpretation of the period we discussed is open to many options, and indeed to some extent reflecting difficult questions which trade unions are sometimes reluctant to debate, but certainly were debated within the ETUC itself. And I mentioned four of these. We mentioned four of these. Was the ETUC primarily an insider? Or was it what Hans-Jürgen Urban calls a veto player? Was it willing to oppose forcefully what it didn't like coming from inside the EU? Or did it prefer to negotiate quietly within what George Woodcock once called the corridors of power? An unresolved question, particularly in the periods when no one seemed to be listening to the ETUC within the corridor of power. Linked to this, what are the limits to support for more Europe? The ETUC has always been one of the most fervent supporters of European integration. In many ways, I like to say that Europe was an ideology which filled the vacuum of political ideology, which beset most European trade unions with the collapse of communism, the deconfessionalization of Christianity, and the erosion of social democracy as a promise of something better. More Europe was seen as the answer. And as more Europe seemed to imply more nasty things coming out of Brussels. How one handles this was never resolved. Bernadette Segal said in 2015, our support for the EU has been conditional and restrictive, but that wasn't always very obvious. And she said when we interviewed her, we could not be in an anti-EU campaign. And this tension between opposing certain things coming out of the EU, but still saying we support the EU, we support more Europe, was an underlying contradiction. What's the role of campaigns and mass demonstrations? What is the relationship with NGOs, or perhaps I should say other NGOs, since though they don't like to define themselves as such, trade unions and NGOs, if they're not governmental organizations as such, under monks, there was a considerable upsurge in demonstrations, but bounded in their character and scope. And soon after Segal came in, demonstrations effectively were wound down. Though it's interesting that in the past 12 months or so, there has been a renewal of active demonstration by the ETUC. And finally, the question, what are we here for? Again, as George Woodcock used to say, was the ETUC meant to be primarily a lobby group? Was it meant to be a, quote, social partner with the commission and or with the employers? Was it meant to be a mobilizing force, a counterpower, a, quote, real trade union, as some called it? Or was it meant to be all of these? It's an unanswered debate, and it's one that continues. So thank you for your patience, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was a very succinct overview. I mean, not just in terms of the historical development of the European Union over the last 30 years, but also a presentation of the debates and dilemmas that face us. And I'm sure we'll come back to those in the discussion. And I should actually have said that we did send out a link, a hyperlink to your book, Rebecca and Richard's book, in the invitation to this seminar. And I would encourage you to read it, because it is a very subtle and I think extremely interesting book, not least for the wide use of interview material of some of the main players, which I think is actually very illuminating. So do read it if you can. If you want a copy and you haven't got the link, then after the seminar, write to me, send me an email, and I will gladly send you a link to Richard and Rebecca's book. Okay, thank you. We'll come back to that. We're now going to move on to Yvonne, who I hope is around somewhere. Yes, Yvonne, there you are. Good. And Yvonne is going to address the issue of the ILO. And I think some of the issues that you present will probably overlap or be complementary to the discussion that we've had already from Richard. So Yvonne, without more ado, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I'm just trying to set up to share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
No, I know. At least I can't.
No.
Okay. Not quite sure what's happening here. Sorry.
Have you got your PowerPoint up?
You have. Linda, did you put my PowerPoint up?
Oh, no, I was thinking that you would do it because then you can turn pages. But if you've got it on your up on your computer and you press share screen, you should be able to see it.
Oh no, there's something going wrong with my settings.
Would you want me to do it? I'll try. But you should have a green button at the bottom which says share.
Yeah.
I'm not sure quite what's happening. I did a test run and it seemed to be sharing fine, but if you can't see it, perhaps Linda, if you wouldn't mind, you could put my slides up.
Yeah, I'm just afraid about the notes. Yes, this is what I feared. That the notes come up. So it's better if you did it.
Okay, I'll keep trying. Sorry.
Well, Yvonne, if you can't, it's better to have Linda's version than nothing at all.
Well, if Linda, can you?
It's just very difficult to read because it's the notes kind of really minimize it.
Yeah.
It's something to do with my privacy settings, which could be because I'm on my home laptop. So I'm just, I think, I'm sorry, Linda, I think we may need to, can you not go?
Yeah. Yvonne, I think that's a better idea. I mean, I think faute de mieux, I think we better stick with this because, I mean, you can read this. And I'd rather have that, I think, from your point of view, than nothing at all.
Look,
are you happy with that, Yvonne?
My apologies about that. I think.
Oh, there we are. There we are. Okay.
Great.
Now.
Thanks, Linda. That's wonderful.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Yvonne.
Just tell me when to turn the page, yes? Or to go and scroll down, yeah?
Thanks very much.
Yes, you can say next slide, please, like a certain scientist. There you are. Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, look, thank you, everybody. Sorry for that brief delay there. Kia ora koutou, as we say here in Te Reo. And thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking with you. I had a wonderful time at your conference in Bristol last year and was very pleased to make the acquaintance of some of you. And it's great to get the opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of my research. As Michael said, I was prompted to go back to university and to quit my role. At that time, I was Deputy Secretary of the Secondary Teachers Union by my experience in the Standard Setting Committee in relation to the Convention on Violence and Harassment. And I was part of the, my role there was as part of the advocates, the work of Vice Chair's technical committee. And for those of you who are familiar with the ILO might realise that role was to support the advocate. And in fact, I had the backing not of the ETUC, but the ITUC funded a lot of my participation there. But one of the things that I was engaged in that role was preparing our arguments in relation to the scope of the convention. And that led me down a track when I realized that although it's always been the position of the office of the ILO that the ILO had very broad jurisdiction, there had been enormous pushback on that, obviously from the employers primarily, but not well-developed arguments in support of that broad jurisdiction in the sense of support for the ILO's constitutional competence. And that triggered my PhD topic. And I don't know if a few of you were potentially at my presentation in Bristol. So I'm trying to avoid repeating too much of that material. And I'm going to try and look sort of more at the more recent period. So essentially what I'm looking at is how the ILO has dealt with issues of scope of coverage and how the standard employment relationship was not just promoted as a good model of work relationships, but actually came to acquire such normative force that it really pushed out any real understanding of the need for standard setting in relation to other types of work arrangement. So I think we'll perhaps turn the page there, Linda, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Go to the next page. So just to give you a little outline of what I plan to talk about, I should just say, first of all, that that photo is not Geneva, that's Wellington. I thought I'd give you a little taste of where I was coming from. We have notoriously bad weather in Wellington. We have the dubious distinction of being the windiest city in the world. But we always say you can't beat Wellington on a good day. And this photo, as you can see, was taken on a good day, just up the road from my house. So if it was daytime and not pitch dark outside, that's what I'd be looking at out of the window. So there you go, that's me. Anyway, in terms of the presentation, we'll begin with just a bit of an outline of the constitutional competence of the ILO and what the Constitution does empower it to do. And I will argue that the text of the Constitution obviously has to be construed in light of the ILO's social justice objectives, and that social justice objective and the language of the Constitution and subsequent litigation or subsequent legal opinion has made it really clear that the ILO does have very broad coverage. I'll then touch on why, notwithstanding that broad coverage, it did come to focus for a while almost exclusively on the standard work arrangements and potential problems with that, which is, notwithstanding the fact that the standard employment relationship has huge benefits for workers and has worked well for unions in many, throughout much of the world, it's also failed in other parts of the world to deliver for workers. And then I'll look at what's come to be called by some scholars the equalizing narrative, where there's been a bit of a pushback towards broad coverage and responsiveness to non-standard work situations and how that's affecting standard setting at the moment. And that, of course, is, as I thought when I started my research, that I better get the damn thing finished, because a convention on platform work, as many of you will know, is on the agenda for the ILC this time next year. And I would imagine that the Workers' Caucus will probably face some of the same pushback on scope that they've experienced in the past. And then just at the very end of the presentation, if I've got time, I wanted to try and sort of link this back a little bit more to the UK context. So I've just sort of added on a wee bit on the end about what's been happening in the UK in terms of the UK's relationship with the ILO. And I'm conscious I'm not an expert in that. I'm sure most of you know a lot more about it than I do, but it might just be a bit of discussion there. Okay, Linda, should we go to the next slide? So just to go back to the beginning, this is a history, an exercise in labour law history, as I say. If we go right back to the founding of the ILO, the history of the ILO really indicates that the UK was the architect, or Great Britain, as it was described then, was the architect of the ILO. The original text, which was tabled for discussion at the Paris Peace Conference and ended up forming the basis for Part 13 of the Treaty of Versailles, was actually drafted by British government officials. And although the detail was subject to negotiation and did change over the course of the discussions of the treaty terms, the substance of the vision, if you like, for the ILO it remained unchanged. And it was as it had, essentially the vision which had been proposed by the British government. So the preamble identified the purpose, as we know, of creating conditions of labour that would achieve worldwide social justice. It was a reformist agenda. It was designed to circumvent competing revolutionary ideologies, but it was a very inspiring vision. What's set out in the Constitution for any of you who may have some familiarity with it. And it was to do that using two main mechanisms. The first was to develop legislative protections for all workers, whether organised or not, in the form of comprehensive minimum standards with, specified areas that they would cover in the Constitution there relating to hours, wages, health and safety. And this would be, the idea was that these would be adopted by all member states and enforced to prevent an international race to the bottom. However, also supported collective organisation and collective bargaining on the basis that freedom of association and collective action were vital and were civil and political freedoms in a liberal democracy. In this regard, they were very conscious that to fail to defend those rights or the rights of collectivity would risk revolution. So two very different approaches which, as we know in labour relations, have often been in tension, but the Constitution, perhaps what those who see its strengths would say that its real strength was that it balanced both approaches in a workable way, and that it did that through the unique tripartite structure of the ILC. And obviously, all of that has its critics, but I guess the fact that it's still here 100 years later does point to the fact that it had some strengths as well, and that it was a mechanism for keeping in balance those competing tensions between the potentially paternalistic approach of minimum standards and collective laissez-faire on the other hand, and trying to find a way of having the two, having recourse to both, I guess. Now, given that the first limb, the minimum standards limb, is designed and is intended to meet the needs of workers who are not necessarily organised and not necessarily well placed to achieve their objectives through collective action, that first limb's existence really is of interest when we start thinking about non-standard work and responses to non-standard work, because the difficulty with non-standard work is often that it is not well organised and is difficult for unions to effectively organise in informal work situations or non-standard work situations. And those, of course, are the situations that protective legislation is designed to address. So this was a very different conception of social justice, and commentators such as Grauer in the 1930s felt that they'd nailed it by having this unique combination of the two. I must say, in some of my research, when I've gone back to a lot of the materials from the 20s and 30s, it is somewhat heartbreaking. Obviously, a lot of it is, it's hype, it's PR of the time, but lauding the progress that the ILO was making in the 20s, and then combination of the Great Depression and obviously World War II kind of brought the whole pack of cards crashing down. But anyway, I think we're ready to move slides again now, Linda. So just in that interwar period, in terms of the successes or the achievements of the ILO, it did adopt essentially the basics of a labour code. People were still talking at that time in terms of a comprehensive labour code, 67 conventions in the first 20 years, which did cover most of the high priority areas, conventions for women and children, conventions relating to specific industries, particularly those like agriculture and the maritime industry, where, basically seafarers were indentured labour at that time. So a lot was achieved, albeit that it has its critics. A lot was achieved in that first period. And it also moved beyond just minimum labour standards to social security. The breadth of their mandate was confirmed very early on by a series of legal opinions by the Permanent Court of International Justice, legal opinions which went a long way to shape thinking about how international organizations such as the ILO would work. And they were very clear that in setting up a new standard-setting body, the authors of the treaty were deliberately trying to future-proof their work. They were deliberately trying to come up with something that would have longevity and would be flexible, so that they were very conscious that they didn't know what the future would look like, and that, you know, the sort of technological change that they'd seen in the last 100 years was only going to accelerate, and that the world of work would look very different in the decades to come. It's quite a feature of my research that I've loved, going back and reading what those people were saying and thinking and what their vision was, and sort of here we are 100 years after the ILO was founded, and what has it succeeded in and what has it failed in. It's striking, the breadth of their ambition. Whether they've achieved it is another question, but it is striking. And as the court recorded in one of its decisions, it said the authors were moved by sentiments of justice and humanity, as well as the desire to secure the permanent peace of the world. And the court expressed the opinion that this language could hardly be more comprehensive. So it found that the treaty must be read as a whole, and that any failure to mention a specific group did not have the effect of excluding them from the coverage of ILS. So the court was very clear that the mandate of the ILO was as broad as it could be. Just mindful that I might need to pick up the pace a little bit, but so if we just perhaps move slides again, Linda, if you wouldn't mind. We then progress, obviously, to the Declaration of Philadelphia, and this was in some measure a response to the challenges posed by both the Great Depression, which the ILO was very conscious of what it saw as its failure to prevent the Great Depression or respond adequately to it. And obviously also to the effects of World War II. In 1941, Edward Phelan, the then Secretary General, observed that labour legislation in the old narrow sense is only a very partial remedy for the social evils which the ILO is created to combat. Future policy is to be directed to ensuring for the individual not only an improvement in conditions of labour, but economic security, without which it is now recognised there can be no fully effective implementation of social justice. So the ILO was very keen to start to get more actively involved in setting economic policy, and the language of the Declaration of Philadelphia was aimed at enabling that. So it goes arguably even wider, although perhaps wider in terms of its subject matter rather than wider in terms of the scope of standard setting. But as we now know, effectively the ILO at that time was participating very much in that post-war economic reconstruction, and it has been said that the Declaration was one of the key documents that helped shape the international political and economic system immediately after the Second World War, partly as a result of this increased involvement in social and economic policy. Now, I'm no expert on that. That is not the focus of my research. But the interesting point to me is that what one might have thought that expanded range of activity into sort of more broader economic and social policy might have been expected to support ongoing standard setting of broad scope. And indeed, as late as 1975, the ILO, the ILC, had no difficulty adopting a convention to protect the rights to organize of sharecroppers and tenant farmers. These were people who were not employed at all. They were in a serious imbalance of power situation with landowners and desperately needed to have their rights to organize promoted and supported. But the fact that they were not subject to an employment contract didn't pose the slightest bit of difficulty for the ILC. That convention got through without problems. So there was still a clear understanding at that point that the ILO could adopt standards of much broader coverage than just employees or just standard employment. And its standard mandate in terms of social and economic issues need not have undermined that or undercut that in any way. Nonetheless, as the ILO moved just from standard setting into more of a focus on what was called technical assistance as part of this economic and social policy program, it also moved away from focus on a broader range of work situations and developed a very strong normative stance in favor of the standard employment relationship. Should we change pages again, Linda? So having been broad, the scope of, and having adopted a number of conventions of broad scope, some of which have been abrogated since then, the ILO moved in the post-war period towards a greater focus on standard employment. Now, why was that? Well, the coverage of decisions about what gets onto the ILO agenda, the ILC's agenda in the first place, are a matter of negotiation at the governing body. Then the coverage of individual instruments is also a matter of negotiation by the parties. So it's a highly contested process, and there's probably less coherence about the agenda and direction of the ILO in some ways than some of us, or some ways than the ILO might sometimes assert. Perhaps it would be easiest. Yeah, we've got more. Thanks, Linda. So in that, those post-war technical assistance programs came to focus on development as more, in the post-war context, more former colonies joined the ILO as members. And more recently, scholars such as Adele Blackett and Guy Sinclair have come to see this development agenda as essentially neo in nature. And some of you may know more about that and have more to say on that than I can. But Guy Sinclair is a New Zealand scholar who's done a lot of work on this impact of shifts, not just in the ILO, but in other international organizations as well, into, if you like, very proactive economic and social policy in the global South, and seeking to influence the development in a very particular direction and a particular model. So that model was to essentially refashion member states along the lines of larger industrialized economies. So active promotion of a Fordist workplace and the standard employment relationship. It didn't necessarily have to follow that emphasis in the technical assistance program would also flow through to standard setting. But given what I've said about the very contested nature of what gets on the agenda and then what scope of coverage of instruments are, I guess perhaps it's not surprising that that focus did also flow through, deliberately or not, into the emphasis in standard setting. So the result, as writers like Judy Fudge have explained, was that the standard employment relationship became firmly institutionalized as part of the post-war capital labour compromise in the ILO, as it had in industrialised countries, because the ILO sought to promote it to all of its member states. Now, this situation, and I've mentioned that as late as 1975, there had been little difficulty in enacting a provision that related, the scope had nothing to do with formal employment at all. We were talking about sharecroppers and tenant farmers. But by 1997, when attempts were made to adopt a convention for what we might call dependent contractors or contractors more generally, amongst others, this conflict around what the proper scope of the ILO was basically scuttled that convention completely. And for me, unpicking why and how that occurred has been a big part of my research. And looking at the debates for that convention really underscores how by that time, as I've mentioned, the normative power of the standard employment relationship and the power of the employment contract as a form was just predominant, or at least in those debates it was, where it seemed impossible for some governments to take on board the idea that concepts such as dependence and subordination might be found in work arrangements which were not or did not fit or were not consistent with a formal contract of employment. So 1997, if you like, and the failure, for the only time, I might add, the only time the ILO has actually embarked on a double discussion process and not achieved something at the end of it, the complete failure of those talks represents, if you like, the point where the standard employment relationship is dominating the discourse in such a way that practical standard setting work for other groups has become completely impossible. So I think we'll move on there, Linda, to the next slide. So if we basically said 1997 was where things got as, from the point of view of, if you're arguing the case for the ILO being able to set minimum standards of work for people outside formal employment, which I am, 1997 was probably, as I say, the lowest point where that convention failed. And all that was achieved was that in 2006, there was a recommendation relating to contract work, which had some value. It was useful as a tool for identifying what were called sham work arrangements, but it certainly would not provide any assistance if we were dealing then with situations like Uber drivers now, where, you know, as soon as you've identified a sham work situation, the employers will come up with a way around it. But we have seen impetus for change since 1997. So some of this impetus for change has come from the Global South and from scholars in the Global South. So if we acknowledge that the standard employment relationship has significant benefits for workers, and that, you know, a lot of good has come out of the fact that labour law systems have been shaped around it. It has facilitated a particular model of unionisation and organising. But nonetheless, particularly if we look at the Global South, for the majority of the world's workers, it hasn't provided a pathway to social justice. Huge numbers of workers in the informal economy have never worked in that type of work arrangement and probably never will. And those workers bear all of the income insecurity and health and safety risks and lack of access to collective bargaining, personal grievances, and minimum standards that arise out of the fact that the employment contract and the standard employment relationship are the gateway to all of those rights. And I alluded earlier to scholars like Adele Blackett and Guy Sinclair, who've framed the ILO's development agenda as a neo-colonialist one. I recently, I was recently looking at the work by Pami Bamu, who may have been she's very much in this labor law history sphere. And in 2019, she did a case study of Zimbabwe, arguing that Zimbabwe, which has a labor law system much like other common law countries, but a tiny proportion of the Zimbabwe workforce is actually covered or has access to that system. And she argued that this demonstrates that labor law's focus on the standard employment relationship is problematic in many countries of the global south, where a sizable proportion of workers, especially women, labor in the informal economy. So that's part of the impetus for change, that some of these scholars are saying, look, actually, we've got these labor law systems, but mostly they're observed in the breach. They don't cover the majority of the workforce. Expectations that people would move from the informal to the formal economy either haven't materialized, or participation in the formal economy still isn't in that full-time, permanent, continuous model. And secondly, of course, I've mentioned already the Platform Work Convention. The other impetus for addressing this issue of scope is that all over the world, technological change is actually creating situations where employers can find ways of avoiding compliance costs. And although, you know, that the growth in numbers perhaps hasn't been as rapid or as significant as some have feared, it's still nonetheless a trend that's not going away. So all of that means I would argue that the ILO does have to consider scope of standard setting and turn its mind to ensuring that it complies with that first limb of its original constitutional mandate of making sure that its protective legislation, its guidance on protective legislation, captures those who need it most. So I think let's move on there, Linda, to the next slide. Oh, we'll skip that one. Skip over to the following one. Sorry, that was the one I was cut. So I was a little bit too long-winded at first. I thought I need to trim a bit of this, so we'll trim that one. So here's a little list of.
Sorry. God, how do I go back? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Oh, thanks, Linda. So this is a little list of recent conventions, which when I went and had a look at them in terms of working on Convention 190, you'll see that actually some recent conventions had popped up that did have broad scope. Now, for whatever reason, I haven't yet looked at all of the debates for all of these conventions, I have to confess, but for whatever reason, the end result thrashed out in the Standard Setting Committee has landed in a place where the conventions are of reasonable breadth. So Convention 183 applies to all employed women, including, I'm quoting here, those in atypical forms of dependent work. So it pops that word dependent in, which is a nod, I guess, to the employment contract, but doesn't put any further restrictions of subordination or in the nature of an employment agreement, all the sorts of things that we had been seeing where people try to pull scope back. The Agriculture Convention in Convention 184 requires plans to cover progressively, this is an obligation on member states to cover progressively all undertakings and all categories of workers. So again, a bit reminiscent of our sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Maritime Labour Convention in 2006, which again, some of you may know a bit more about this particular convention, a key convention, defines a seafarer as anyone who is employed or engaged or works in any capacity on board a ship, and a seafarer's employment agreement, and again I'm quoting, includes both a contract of employment and articles of agreement. Fisher means every person employed or engaged in any capacity or carrying out an occupation on board any fishing vessel, including those who are paid on the basis of a share of the catch. And that had previously been quite a sticking point, even in the early days of the ILO, that people remunerated by a share of the catch were excluded from earlier protections. And a fisher's work agreement also, again, includes any other contract governing a fisher's living and working conditions on board a vessel. Then in 2011, perhaps some of the employers having kind of become alerted to, that this was now a very live debate again, the Domestic Workers Convention is actually framed in somewhat narrower terms, where a domestic worker is any person engaged in domestic work within an employment relationship. However, the Committee of Experts has decided that in this context, employment relationship should be construed widely. It need not be any kind of formal contractual agreement or necessarily employment as opposed to a dependent contractor. So there does seem to be some response, as it were, to this, what some of these scholars have called the equalizing narrative of attempting to bring non-standard work more to the fore and to look at expanding the scope of minimum standards to capture more of these workers. And the upshot was Convention 190, which, Linda, if we move on to that one, next slide, and actually just pop it all up, Linda, if you like, it's probably easier. So this is the one that I was working on, and obviously this particular clause I worked on quite extensively, so I have to just acknowledge that my ability to be an objective scholarly inquirer falls down a wee bit here, because I was personally involved and somewhat invested in this. So I've just on the left of the table there, the left of the table is a series of categories that were developed by Mark Friedland and Nicola Contouris in 2011 in their seminal work on personal work relationships, where they tried to unpack the whole basis of the employment relationship and the employment contract. And they said, well, look, let's scope the whole domain, if you like, of people who we might arguably want to see captured by one or more aspects of labour law that might be in need of protections of some sort, whether they were enabling protections like rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining, or they were minimum codes such as minimum wage. So looking as broadly as possible. And they came up with these categories on the left when they scoped the whole of that domain. I think they're useful categories. Some commentators such as Judy Fudge have noted that they don't include unpaid social reproductive labour and other sort of traditionally female care work, which obviously means they don't quite capture the whole domain of work, but they do capture a very broad domain and I think amount to the sort of broad approach that I would say is supported by the ILO Constitution.
Yvonne, if you don't mind, you do need to begin to wind up now, with respect.
Yes.
Because I want to make sure we got time for discussion at the end. I'm sorry to interrupt.
I can make this the last slide, and
Okay.
I can skip the stuff on the UK, which is a separate add-on anyway. So just to wind up, this this mapping exercise that I've done here is just the content of the left-hand side is the scope of coverage of Convention 190, which arguably is the broadest that we've seen of any convention, because that's the nature of the conventions. The Health and Safety Convention goes very wide. And if I can just conclude by reading out the coverage clause, I have to say it's clumsy. It's not a piece of beautifully elegant drafting, but it reads as follows. It protects workers and other persons in the world of work, including employees as defined by national law and practice, as well as persons working irrespective of their contractual status, persons in training, including interns and apprentices, workers whose employment has been terminated, volunteers, job seekers, job applicants, individuals exercising the authority, duties, or responsibilities of an employer, by which they mean individual human beings in small businesses, and applies to all sectors, whether private or public, both in the formal and informal economy, and whether in urban or rural areas. So Convention 190, I think it goes even wider than Friedland and Contouris, and arguably represents the widest scope of coverage that we've seen in the ILO, and signals that the contested area of scope has perhaps the pendulum swung back a little bit in favor of broad scope, which might augur well for the negotiations for the Platform Convention. And I'll wind up there. Thank you. We'll skip the final slides.
Yvonne, thank you very much indeed, again, for an extremely succinct presentation, both historically and also putting your finger on the main dilemmas that face the ILO and the way they've been trying to deal with them. And I would like now just to open it up for discussion. We were hoping to finish about 6:45 our time. Sorry, yes, that's right, 6:45, beg your pardon, our time. And that's 7:45 in the morning, I'm afraid, for you, Yvonne. But if anybody would like to ask a question to our speakers, please either indicate by waving at me, or else by pressing on your electronic hand that kind of waves. There must be some questions. Not a single question. I can't believe I've got a question right from Anibel Ferrus Comelo. Anibel, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed both presentations. They were brilliant, very helpful to have some of the historical context.
Yeah,
a question for both, actually, because what Yvonne just presented about the scope of the ILO reminded me about my work on global supply chains, and I wondered for both, in relation to both presentations, to what extent are the existing provisions covering those workers who are not necessarily producing within, well, they're producing within a global set of employment relations that are diffused along supply chains. And there's an informalization of employment even within what we consider the formal sector of manufacturing, services, etc. How do each of these fit in? And I'm thinking about my own research in India and electronics and garment industries. So I'd be interested in hearing from both presentations.
Thank you for that. Do we have another question which we can combine from anybody?
Yes. Jörn.
Jörn, oh yes, okay. If you'd like to ask your question, Jörn, we'll take that together.
Yeah, I wonder why it wasn't mentioned that the ILO has passed the Declaration for the Future of Work in 2019, and well, that doesn't already have an impact.
Did you hear that, Yvonne?
I did, yes.
Good. Okay. All right. So if we take those two questions together then, well, Yvonne, let's start with you, since I And then we'll go on to Richard.
I'll start. Yeah. Okay.
Please, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Look, just taking Annabelle's question first.
Yeah.
It's a great question. My presentation today focused mainly on scope in relation to employees, but identifying the liable party or working out who is the employer is the other half of that equation, which I didn't really explore today. The failed convention, the 1997 convention, did seek to address triangular work relationships, which are not exactly what you're talking about, because the supply chain liabilities are a slightly different issue to a triangular work relationship. But yes, that issue of how to actually identify who should be responsible for enforcing and giving effect to minimum entitlements of whatever sort, including health and safety, is the other half of the coin from working out which workers should be captured by the protections. And that is another and quite extensive separate piece of work that's going on. And that question we had there on the Declaration on the Future of Work also looks at those issues. So the employer side of the equation, as well as the employee side of the equation, in terms of who bears responsibility, not necessarily exclusively, because in a supply chain situation, responsibility might be shared by more than one party. So I think that Declaration on the Future of Work, that 2019 declaration, is undoubtedly part of this pushback, this equalizing narrative. It's focused somewhat on that sort of economic and social aspect, rather than really trying to grapple with those legal issues of how we identify the parties and how we determine liability. But it's certainly an acknowledgement that the standard setting work of the ILO will be pointless if it doesn't address these developments, working out from a legal perspective exactly who is covered and who are the rights of, who has rights and who bears responsibilities is the challenge. And I think that links both those questions.
Thank you. Richard, do you want to add anything to this? You need to unmute. That's it.
I don't know if Rebecca does as well, but
Rebecca might want to say something as well. Yeah.
I don't know that our book really covers those particular issues, so I defer to Richard.
we do have quite a section about trade agreements.
Oh yes, so we have, yeah.
And that clearly is relevant. Yeah. Laying down conditions, social conditions in EU trade agreements. A fairly contentious point, since trade unions in some countries are much more concerned about this than others. In the main, I would say that relations with workers outside Europe is primarily the job of the sectoral trade union federations, as well as the global union federations, obviously, rather than the ETUC itself. But certainly if one looks at the ETUC's own programs and reports, a fair amount of attention to questions of the kind that Annabelle raised.
Thank you. Peter, I think you've had your hand up for a while.
Yes, thank you. Good evening and good morning, in fact.
Yeah.
I wanted to really ask about not just the what, but the how For those who don't know me, I was formerly a national officer with the union, what's now Unite. I ended up, not by design, but leading the workers' delegation at the ILO in tripartite negotiation on electronics industry. And the hardest part, getting the trade unions to agree, you're dealing with 10 representatives from workers, 10 from employers, 10 from government. And even though we're from 5 different continents, getting the unions to a common voice was not that difficult. The greatest difficulty was trying to get the employers to speak with one voice, and in particular the differences between the representatives from Europe and the representatives from the Americas, by which primarily I mean the United States. And we had to do lots of corridor meetings, actually trying to help the employers to get an agreement amongst themselves before we could even get in the room with everybody. I just wondered whether you had an experience, Yvonne, first of all, of other negotiations in the ILO and how they work out, particularly divisions between different experiences and different setups across different continents, primarily between the United States and elsewhere. And I suppose at the European level, whether there are equivalents, Richard, in between perhaps some cases now, some of the Eastern European countries with different traditions to the traditions of, inverted commas, the more Western European countries. And if so, how you go about trying to bridge those gaps.
Yvonne, if you...
Yeah, look, in terms of standard setting committees, I mean, I'm not sure how you may have participated in more than me, but I've only got direct personal experience of that one, although I've also gone through the debates of a number of others. But I mean, the Convention 190 was a very complex process because there was a lot of involvement of NGOs as well, who were welcomed by the Union Caucus. I mean, we worked well with them. There were people who'd been working on issues to do with gender violence for decades, and were in the room and providing really helpful input. There were so many moving parts that I must say, at several points during the negotiations, it seemed like a miracle if we ever got a convention. But we did in the end. The moving parts came together in this hugely complex process. And I think for any, I mean, there has been some research done on, you know, from a, I suppose, organizational behavior, a sociological perspective on how they work. They're fascinating environments, but certainly that problem with the employers not speaking with one voice is very difficult, because for the workers' caucus, we had our differences, but we thrashed them out in caucus when we arrived at the floor of the standard setting committee, and there were often 400 or 500 people in the room in the standard setting committee for the Convention on Violence. It was huge. But when we arrived in the room, we spoke with one voice because we were unionists and we knew what discipline was, and we kept our debates to the caucus. And then when we got there, we'd hammered out a position, and we did hammer out a position reasonably quickly in caucuses, because we didn't have room or scope to fret about the fine detail because we were facing such a strong pushback from the employers. If I think about the Domestic Workers Convention, that one nearly fell over. And at the end of the first double discussion process, the employers couldn't come to any kind of consensus. And that was a really important convention from the point of view of all these equalizing narratives. You know, domestic work is the single biggest occupational group in the world. More people do domestic work than any other single job, and there had been no protections for them in almost 100 years of the ILO. But what I have to say, New Zealand played a bit of a role in this, because there's quite a moderate employers association, very experienced person in the Employers Association here in New Zealand, and he was brought in as employer's chair for the second double discussion process. He's just got good soft skills, and he managed to bring his caucus together. And Adele Blackett credits him with having managed to avert catastrophe and get that convention over the line, which really nobody in their right minds could have argued that it wasn't a very good idea, but it nearly did fall over. So I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, because it is an extraordinarily difficult process, and employers can have a multitude of ways in which they can sabotage it.
Thanks, Yvonne. Richard and Rebecca, do you want to say anything on that? It wasn't really directed at you, but you might have some comments.
If I could say something.
Yeah.
Of course, trade unions are democratic organizations and employers associations are not. And that's one big advantage, as Yvonne has just said. I mean, I myself am a former international trade union official in the food and agricultural sector, the IUF, and preparing for discussions of whatever the relevant recommendations and conventions were was always extremely fraught. But, you know, once you're in the room, you're all in agreement. But back to the ETUC, I mean, every international or European trade union organization has the problem of getting unity among its ranks with a variety of different interests, different regions, different points of view. In the ETUC, it's Peter has mentioned the issue of Central and Eastern Europe, but actually the most, you know, the strongest conflict between affiliates, as Richard has referred to, was probably over the issue of the European minimum wage, where the Nordic unions firmly opposed any European-wide agreement. And at one point, Richard, remind me, because I'm not quite with it at the moment. Sorry, I'm on antibiotics and so on. I'm not quite with it. Was it the Swedish unions who sent a letter to the Commission?
It was all the Nordics.
All the disagreeing with the ETUC position.
Yeah.
Which was quite extraordinary. And it was really the work of several years and the very important role of the then General Secretary Bernadette Segal to finally reach agreement on the European minimum wage. But on the issue of you know, the disagreements between Central and Eastern European unions and those in the West, I mean, there's many issues in which there were very important disagreements over transitional measures, for example, and you know, where it would have been in the interest of many of the unions and the workers in those countries to want no transitional measures, to have, you know, lots more work available for their citizens. And they were convinced with time that in the long run that would not be to their advantage. And there again, there are important personal roles in particular for Josef Niemic, the Deputy General Secretary, who was formerly from Solidarność. And also in the issue of Bolkestein. Again, the Central and Eastern European unions might have done well out of that, but they put their own sort of short-term advantage aside. Richard may have something to add there.
Right. So, I mean, I think Peter was asking also about employers getting their ducks in a row.
For sure.
I mean, here it's important, I think, that the ETUC one is talking about cross-sectoral confederations. Business Europe is itself well organized and has the advantage of being a more or less uncontested representative of the employer interest. So it speaks with one voice. That voice is usually to say no. If one's looking at sectoral level, it becomes more complicated, I think. But in general, one has to take account of the rather different sets of problems in getting any agreement at European level, because it's the political complexity of the EU itself as a policy-making structure with Commission, Council, Parliament, all of them very divided internally. Getting any sort of consensus across everything, all the actors before one brings in, employers and unions, is an amazingly difficult task.
Yes. Thank you very much, everybody. Joe, you've had your hand up for a while. I think we've got time for one more question. If you'd like to go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you, Richard, Rebecca and Yvonne for really fascinating presentations. My questions are possibly slightly unfair, so please disregard them if not suitable for discussion. But Richard, you mentioned that COVID impacted on the process of getting qualitative data and interviews, and I wondered what you felt you missed or what you think could have been added in relation to speaking to some key informants. And to Yvonne, again, our discipline doesn't really lend itself to prediction, but I just wondered, in the light of the trends that you'd noted, what you felt were the kind of prospects for the gig workers convention. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, Richard, if you'd like to go first.
Okay, thanks. There are a lot of unions in a lot of countries that had interesting positions, and we would have wanted to talk to people from them in more detail. I think that's the key point. We were limited in the range of voices we could listen to, and the range of opinions that we could draw in. I don't know if Rebecca wants to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, those of you who see the book will realize how much it relies on documentation, including the ETUC's own documentation, reports of its meetings of its executive and so on, which makes it a very, very dry reading a lot of the time. It would have relied more on interviews, but some of the most interesting and important information we got in person through interviews, some information we might not have got otherwise if we had not been with someone in person and they made an aside. We didn't always name them, but Richard probably knows what I'm thinking of. But yeah, there is a dimension that was missed, but we hope to return to the subject later. Very interesting question. Thank you.
Yvonne. Oh, you need to unmute. You're muted. That's it.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry. Thanks for that question. I think that's obviously that, you know, in one sense, having spoken about the highly contested and political nature of the process, a lot will depend on how and the comment about the Employers Caucus, a lot will depend on how the Employers Caucus approaches this and who is there, because potentially from the employer's side, the people pulling the strings may not be in the room. The employers who employ significant numbers of gig workers may or may not be present. So that political side of it is extremely hard to predict. In terms of the legal side, however, which was blamed to some extent for the 97 failure, people described the problems as being around the definitional issues of working out how you identified the groups who needed to be covered. If you weren't going to use the employment agreement as a proxy for people who needed to be covered, how were you going to define them? I think we've made some progress on those definitional issues. in the work in labour law scholarship in the last 20 years. I think it's that side of it is not as problematic. However, there's a big gap between what lawyers think and what actually happens in the room at the ILO. And as I say, the final documents, they're not elegant, they're not tidy. The group pulls apart the officer's nice draft that they propose, and you end up with something else. But I have heard people are quite optimistic about the platform convention. People closer to it than I am are optimistic. So fingers crossed. I don't see any major obstacles to it from a legal perspective, just political obstacles really in terms of how the employers caucus operates.
Okay. I think I see from the clock this is exactly 1:45. I think it's probably time to finish. I haven't had any more questions anyway, so perhaps it's time to wrap up. Can I say how really very grateful I am to our 3 contributors, Rebecca, Richard and Yvonne. And again, particularly Yvonne, I have to single out for your sterling efforts in getting up so early in the morning to help us. And I would just like to thank everybody for coming along and for participating in what's been an extremely stimulating discussion. BUIRA do hold these regular events. Do look out for future ones. And I look forward to seeing you all in the future again. So thanks for everybody. And I think that's probably time to go. Okay, bye everybody.
Thank you.